Hello, dear friend, and welcome. I'm so happy you're here tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. What country are you in? And what time is it where you are right now? Let me know in the comments below. I truly enjoy reading them, and every message reminds me that, although we're scattered across the world, we're all sharing this peaceful moment together. Your kind words, your support, and your comments give me the motivation to keep creating these cozy bedtime stories, and they make this journey feel like something we're taking together. If these stories help you relax, unwind, or fall asleep, I'd be so grateful if you left a like and subscribed. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to create many more peaceful, rainy adventures for you. Tonight, we're traveling to the quiet English village of Brambleford, where it has been raining for 3 long days. Cold mist hangs over the hills. Lanterns glow softly through rain-covered windows, and every cobblestone lane glistens beneath the endless downpour. Before morning arrives, one ordinary man will set out on an unforgettable journey through the storm to bring home the village midwife. So make yourself as comfortable as you can. Pull your blanket a little closer, rest your head, and let the gentle rhythm of the rain carry away the weight of the day. Wherever you are, I hope you're warm, safe and at peace. May this story quiet your mind, slow your thoughts, and gently guide you into a deep, restful sleep filled with the sweetest dreams. Now, close your eyes, listen to the rain, and let's begin. For 3 days and 3 nights, the rain had scarcely paused. It swept across the little valley of Brambleford in endless silver curtains, drumming upon slate rooftops, filling stone lanes with water and wrapping every hill in cold, drifting mist. The great oak trees stood dark and motionless, their branches glistening beneath the steady downpour, while the river beyond the village had risen quietly with every passing hour. It was the kind of rain that found its way everywhere. It trickled beneath cottage doors, gathered upon windowsills, and slipped through the smallest cracks in old roofs. Every chimney breathed pale ribbons of smoke into the wet evening air, only for the wind to carry them away among the fog. The village had grown unusually quiet. No children chased one another through the lanes. The blacksmith's hammer had long since fallen silent. Even the horses remained inside their stables, their warm breath rising like little clouds in the cold. Only the rain seemed awake. Tap, tap, tap. It played softly upon windows, whispered through hedgerows, and splashed into puddles that reflected the warm glow of lanterns hanging outside the cottages. Near the far end of the village stood a small stone cottage with ivy climbing its walls and smoke curling gently from its chimney. Inside, a modest fire crackled in the hearth. Its warm light danced across worn wooden beams, polished copper pots, and a sturdy rocking chair beside the fireplace. Elizabeth sat quietly there, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. One hand rested gently upon her expectant belly, while the other held a cup of warm herbal tea that had already begun to cool. Every so often she glanced toward the little window overlooking the lane. Her husband Thomas had gone before sunrise to earn a few shillings hauling timber from the forest. He should have been home hours ago. Outside, the rain fell harder. The wind sighed around the cottage, making the old signpost at the end of the lane creak softly. Elizabeth listened carefully. For a long while there was nothing. Then, somewhere beyond the mist, came the faint sound of horse hooves slowly climbing the muddy road toward the village. The sound of hooves came slowly. Clop, clop, squelch. Each step sank deep into the soaked earth before pulling free with a heavy sigh. Somewhere beyond the mist, a cartwheel groaned as it struggled through the mud. Thomas drew the reins gently. "Easy now, Bracken," he murmured to the old bay horse. The faithful animal lowered its head against the rain. Its warm breath drifted into the freezing air like white smoke, disappearing almost as quickly as it appeared. The narrow lane had become little more than a stream of brown water. Thick mud clung stubbornly to the cart wheels, refusing to let them turn. More than once, Thomas climbed down, his boots sinking nearly to his ankles as he pushed against the heavy timber piled behind him. The wheels did not give in easily. For a moment it felt as though the earth itself had wrapped its hands around them. Thomas leaned his shoulder against the cart. "One more try, old friend." Bracken stepped forward. The leather harness stretched tight. The wooden spokes creaked. Slowly, very slowly, the wheels broke free with a wet sucking sound, spraying muddy water across the lane. Thomas laughed softly, patting the horse's neck. "That's it." Together they continued through the rain. Lanterns glowed warmly in the windows of scattered cottages. Behind rain-speckled glass, families gathered close to their fires while kettles gently steamed above glowing hearths. The comforting sight made Thomas smile. He imagined Elizabeth waiting beside their own fireplace, perhaps with a pot of vegetable stew warming over the fire. He had earned only a few shillings that day, but it was enough to buy flour, oats, and a little tea from Mr. Whitmore's village shop tomorrow. The thought lightened his tired heart. Ahead, through the drifting curtain of mist, the familiar outline of Brambleford slowly emerged. The church bell struck 8 slow notes. Its gentle sound rolled across the rain-soaked valley. Thomas lifted the lantern hanging beneath the cart. "There we are," he whispered. "Home." He had no way of knowing that before this long, rainy night was over, he would leave that cottage again, not for work, but on the most important journey of his life. Thomas guided Bracken into the small stable beside the cottage. The old horse gave a tired shake, scattering tiny droplets of rain from his mane. Thomas removed the heavy harness, spread a dry blanket across the horse's back, and filled the manger with the last of the hay. "Rest well," he said with a gentle pat. "You've earned it." The warmth from the stable lingered only for a moment. As soon as Thomas stepped outside, the cold rain greeted him once more. It drummed upon his broad hat and trickled down the collar of his coat as he hurried across the little garden path. The cottage door opened before he could knock. Elizabeth smiled with relief. "I was beginning to worry." Thomas hung his dripping coat beside the hearth and held his hands over the fire. The room smelled of burning oak, warm herbs, and fresh bread that had been baked that morning. "It took twice as long to get home," he said. "Half the road to Ashcombe has disappeared beneath mud. Old Mr. Fletcher's wagon was buried nearly to its axle." Elizabeth poured him a bowl of hot vegetable broth. For a little while nothing seemed unusual. The rain tapped gently against the windows. The fire crackled. The old clock in the corner ticked steadily. Then Elizabeth paused. A faint ache crossed her face. She rested one hand upon the edge of the table and drew a slow breath. Thomas looked up. "Are you all right?" She smiled again, though this one was smaller. "I think so." After a moment, the feeling passed. It was only a little pain. Thomas nodded, though a quiet worry settled in his heart. The baby was not due for several more weeks. Outside, the wind gathered strength. Rain lashed against the windows, and somewhere beyond the mist, the swollen river murmured louder than it had the night before. Neither of them noticed the old village clock striking another hour. The longest night of their lives had only just begun. The evening settled quietly over Brambleford. Dark clouds pressed low against the hills, hiding even the tallest pine trees beyond the village. The rain no longer fell in gentle drops. It poured from the sky in heavy sheets, rattling against the slate roof like thousands of tiny pebbles. The fire burned steadily in the hearth. Thomas placed another oak log upon the glowing embers. It hissed softly as a few drops of rain fell from his damp sleeve. Elizabeth sat in the rocking chair, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. She had tried to continue, but another dull pain had come and gone, lasting a little longer than the first. Thomas noticed. "Shall I fetch Mrs. Hawthorne?" he asked. Mrs. Hawthorne was the village's oldest midwife. She had welcomed nearly every child born in Brambleford. Elizabeth gently shook her head. "It's still too soon," she whispered. "Perhaps I only need some rest." Thomas wished he could believe that. The old grandfather clock gave a slow, steady chime. 9 o'clock. Outside, the wind rushed through the narrow lane, making the hanging lantern outside the cottage sway back and forth. Across the village, shutters were fastened tightly. Stable doors were barred. Smoke curled from chimneys before vanishing into the cold mist. Then, a sharp knock echoed against the cottage door. 3 slow knocks. Thomas opened it to find old Mr. Wilcox, the miller, wrapped in a dripping oilskin cloak. "The brook has overflowed," the old man said. "The lower bridge is already under water. If this rain keeps up, no cart will cross it by midnight." Thomas thanked him quietly. As the old miller disappeared into the rain, Thomas looked toward the dark lane. Beyond that flooded bridge, nearly 7 miles away in the neighbouring village of Ashcombe, lived Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne, the best midwife in the valley. He closed the door slowly. Behind him, Elizabeth drew a deeper breath than before and placed both hands gently over her belly. This time, the pain did not fade quite so quickly. The cottage grew quiet once more. Only the rain spoke now. It drummed upon the roof, trickled from the eaves, and rattled softly against the window panes. The wind sighed down the chimney, making the fire flicker and cast long, dancing shadows across the stone walls. Thomas knelt beside Elizabeth. "Has it eased?" She nodded, though she looked paler than before. For a little while, he reached for her hand. It felt colder than it should have. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a small brass clock. Its steady ticking seemed louder than ever. Tick, tick, tick. Almost half an hour passed before another pain came. Elizabeth gripped the arm of the rocking chair and closed her eyes. She tried not to cry out, breathing slowly until it faded. When she finally looked at Thomas, she saw the worry he was trying so hard to hide. "I think," she whispered, "you should fetch Mrs. Hawthorne." Thomas lowered his head. Ashcombe was nearly 7 miles away. On a clear summer afternoon, the journey was long enough. Tonight, the lanes were rivers of mud. The lower bridge was under water. The forest road would be slippery and dark. Even Bracken, their faithful horse, had returned exhausted from hauling timber all day. Another clap of distant thunder rolled across the hills. Thomas stood and quietly pulled on his heavy wool coat. He trimmed the wick of the hurricane lantern until its warm glow grew brighter. Then he took down the thick waterproof cloak hanging beside the door. Elizabeth watched him. "Promise me you'll be careful." He smiled gently. "I'll bring her home." He opened the cottage door. An icy gust of wind swept inside, carrying the smell of wet earth, pine trees, and cold rain. The lantern flame trembled. Outside, the storm waited in the darkness. Thomas stepped into the rain. The door closed softly behind him. The rain welcomed Thomas without mercy. Within moments, tiny beads of water covered his oilskin cloak. His boots sank into the muddy lane with every step, leaving deep prints that quickly filled with rainwater. Behind him, the warm glow of the cottage window grew smaller and smaller until it became only a golden speck in the darkness. Ahead lay nothing but mist. Thomas lifted the hurricane lantern a little higher. Its soft amber light reached only a few yards before being swallowed by the rain. Beyond it, the world seemed to disappear. Tap, tap, tap. Rain danced upon the lantern's glass. The hedgerows lining the lane glistened with water. Bare branches bowed beneath the weight of the storm, scattering cold droplets whenever the wind passed through. At the edge of the village stood the old stone well. Beside it, Mr. Carter, the night watchman, pulled his heavy cloak tighter around his shoulders. "Out on a night like this?" he called. "I'm fetching Mrs. Hawthorne," Thomas replied. The old man's face softened. He glanced toward the dark sky. "You'd best avoid the lower bridge." the brooks become a river, take the forest road instead." Thomas nodded gratefully. "It will add another mile," Mr. Carter continued, "but you'll keep your feet dry if the forest hasn't claimed the path already." A faint smile crossed Thomas's face. "I'll take my chances." The watchman lifted his lantern in farewell. "God be with you, and with you." Thomas turned onto the narrow forest lane. Almost at once, the shelter of the cottages disappeared. Towering pines rose silently on either side, their branches weaving together above the road like the roof of a great cathedral. Rainwater dripped steadily from the needles. The wind whispered through the trees. Somewhere deeper in the darkness, an owl called once before falling silent again. Thomas tightened his grip on the lantern and walked on. Far ahead, hidden beyond the forest and the mist, Mrs. Hawthorne slept peacefully, unaware that before the night was over, all of Brambleford would be depending on her. The forest seemed colder than the open valley. Tall pines swayed gently above Thomas, their dark trunks disappearing into the mist. Rainwater gathered upon the branches and fell in heavy drops, pattering onto the carpet of pine needles below. The narrow lane wound quietly between moss-covered stones and ancient oaks. In places, it had almost vanished beneath thick mud. Thomas walked carefully. Each step had to be chosen. His lantern swung gently from his hand, casting a warm circle of light over the ground. Outside that small glow, the forest faded into darkness. A little farther ahead, he heard a familiar sound. Clop, clop, a horse. Then came the creak of wooden wheels. Out of the mist appeared a farmer's cart, pulled by two sturdy chestnut horses. Their coats were soaked, and every breath they exhaled rose into the freezing air like white clouds. The driver, an elderly farmer named Mr. Ellis, drew the reins. "Evening, Thomas," he called. "Evening. What brings you out in weather fit only for ducks?" "I'm on my way to Ashcombe. Elizabeth's taken ill. I must fetch Mrs. Hawthorne." The old farmer's cheerful face turned serious. Without another word, he climbed down from the cart. "Come." He pointed toward the rear wheel. It had sunk deep into the mud. "So deep I can't move an inch." Thomas set down his lantern and pushed beside him. The horses leaned into their harnesses. Leather straps tightened. The wheels groaned. For a moment, nothing happened. The mud clung stubbornly to the spokes, as though the road itself refused to let go. "Again," Mr. Ellis said. The horses strained harder. Thomas planted both boots firmly in the slippery ground and pushed with all his strength. With a loud, wet pull, the wheel broke free. The cart lurched forward, splashing muddy water across the lane. Mr. Ellis laughed with relief. "Bless you, lad." He reached beneath the seat and handed Thomas a thick wool scarf. "You'll need this more than I do before the night's through." Thomas accepted it with grateful hands. "Thank you." The old farmer tipped his hat, clicked gently to his horses, and disappeared into the curtain of rain. Thomas wrapped the warm scarf around his neck, lifted his lantern once more, and continued deeper into the forest. Somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the mist and the trees, the sound of rushing water was growing louder. The sound of rushing water followed Thomas through the forest. It was no longer the gentle murmur of a woodland stream. The rain had turned it into a fast, churning torrent that echoed through the trees. The path began to climb. Wet roots twisted across the ground like old ropes, hidden beneath fallen leaves. Moss-covered stones gleamed in the lantern light, slippery as glass. Thomas slowed his pace. The rain showed no sign of easing. Then he stopped. Across the narrow forest road lay an enormous oak. Its great trunk stretched from one side of the path to the other, its branches tangled among the pines. Fresh splinters of pale wood glistened where the wind had torn it from its roots. The storm had brought down one of the oldest trees in the forest. Thomas held the lantern high. There was no room to walk around it. The hillside rose steeply to his left, while the ground fell away sharply to his right into a rocky stream swollen with rain. He rested a hand against the rough bark. The trunk was far too large to climb over while carrying a lantern and wearing a heavy cloak. For a moment he stood listening. The rain drummed on the leaves. The wind sighed through the broken branches. Then from somewhere behind him came another sound. Voices, faint at first, then closer. Golden lanterns appeared one by one through the mist. 3 woodsmen emerged from the darkness, each carrying an axe over his shoulder. "Trees beaten you too?" one of them asked with a tired smile. Thomas nodded. "I must reach Ashcombe before dawn." The oldest woodsman looked at the fallen oak, then at the storm above. "Well," he said, tightening his grip on his axe, "standing here won't move it." Without another word, the 3 men stepped toward the great tree. Thomas quietly set down his lantern and rolled up his sleeves. The night was about to demand more from all of them. Rainwater streamed down the bark of the fallen oak, making it shine in the lantern light. The oldest woodsman ran his weathered hand along the trunk and gave a quiet nod. "We don't need to move the whole tree," he said, "only enough to make a path." The 3 men set their lanterns beneath a nearby pine where the wind could not reach them. The forest grew alive with a new sound. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The axes bit steadily into the fresh wood. The scent of wet oak drifted through the cold air, mixing with the earthy smell of rain-soaked moss and pine needles. Small chips of pale timber scattered across the muddy road, quickly disappearing beneath the falling rain. Thomas picked up a stout branch and dragged it aside. Another woodsman cut away the smaller limbs that blocked the path. No one hurried. They worked with calm determination, pausing only to catch their breath as white clouds escaped their mouths into the freezing air. After several minutes, the great trunk shifted. "Again," the oldest woodsman called. Together they pushed. The soaked bark refused to move at first, as though the forest wished to keep it where it had fallen. Then with a deep groan, the oak rolled just enough for a narrow gap to appear, wide enough for one man. Thomas looked through the opening. Beyond it, the forest road continued into the darkness, disappearing beneath curtains of mist. He turned to the 3 men. "I don't know how to thank you." The eldest smiled warmly. "One day you'll help someone else. That's thanks enough." Thomas shook each man's hand. He lifted his lantern, pulled his cloak tightly around his shoulders, and stepped through the narrow opening. Behind him, the steady rhythm of axes began again as the woodsman continued clearing the road for whoever might travel after him. Ahead, the rain still fell without mercy, and somewhere beyond the forest, a small stone cottage waited, where Mrs. Hawthorne slept, unaware that every passing minute mattered. The forest slowly began to thin. The towering pines gave way to scattered birch trees, their silver trunks gleaming with rain. Beyond them, Thomas could hear the roar of water much more clearly now. It was Mill Brook. Normally it was little more than a gentle stream that children crossed on warm summer afternoons, hopping from one stone to another. Tonight it was unrecognizable. The brook had burst its banks, racing through the valley in a torrent of brown water. Branches, leaves, and broken logs tumbled along the current before vanishing into the darkness. The little wooden footbridge still stood, but only just. Water rushed over its planks, and every few moments the bridge shuddered beneath the force of the current. Thomas stopped at its edge. He lifted the lantern, watching the water swirl beneath him. One wrong step. He drew a slow breath and tightened the strap of his satchel across his shoulder. "Steady," he whispered to himself. He placed one boot onto the bridge. The old timber creaked. Another step. Rain drummed on the brim of his hat. The lantern flame flickered wildly behind the glass. Halfway across, a thick branch crashed into one of the bridge's supports. The entire bridge lurched beneath him. Thomas instinctively reached for the rope handrail. It was slick with rain, but he held on. The current below roared louder than ever. For a heartbeat, nothing moved except the water. Then the bridge settled once more. Thomas waited until his breathing slowed. Carefully, one step at a time, he crossed the remaining planks. When his boots finally touched solid ground, he turned back. The bridge disappeared almost completely into the mist, its outline barely visible through the sheets of rain. He pulled his coat tighter against the cold and looked ahead. Far in the distance, through the drifting fog, a faint amber light glowed from the hillside. Ashcombe. Mrs. Hawthorne's village was finally within reach. Thomas allowed himself a small smile and continued into the rain, unaware that the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. The light grew brighter with every step. Ashcombe rested quietly upon the hillside, its stone cottages huddled together against the storm. Warm lanterns glowed behind rain-speckled windows, and thin ribbons of smoke drifted from chimneys before melting into the mist. The village was asleep, only the rain remained awake. Thomas hurried along the narrow lane until he reached a small ivy-covered cottage at the very end of the village. A brass lantern hung beside the oak door, its flame burning steadily despite the wind. He lifted the heavy iron knocker. Knock. A moment passed, then another. He knocked again, a little harder this time. At last, footsteps creaked across the wooden floor. The door opened slowly. Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne stood in the doorway, holding a candle. Though well into her 70s, her eyes were bright and kind. A thick grey shawl rested upon her shoulders, and silver hair escaped from beneath her bonnet. "Thomas," she said in surprise, "what brings you here at this hour?" He removed his hat, rainwater dripping onto the stone step. "It's Elizabeth. Her pains have begun." Mrs. Hawthorne's gentle expression changed at once. "How long?" "Only a few hours, but they're growing stronger." The old midwife glanced toward the storm outside. The rain beat against the windows. The wind rattled the garden gate. Without a single complaint, she turned back into the cottage. "Come in for just a moment." The room smelled of lavender, beeswax, and drying herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Mrs. Hawthorne opened a polished wooden chest and carefully placed inside rolls of clean linen, small glass bottles of herbal tinctures, bandages, scissors, and a kettle wrapped in cloth. She fastened the chest shut with a leather strap. Then she reached for her thick traveling cloak. "It seems," she said with a warm smile, "that another little soul has chosen a very wet night to arrive." Thomas couldn't help but smile too. A few moments later, they stepped back into the freezing rain. The cottage door closed behind them. The journey home had begun. The rain struck their cloaks the moment they stepped outside. Mrs. Hawthorne pulled the hood over her bonnet and lifted her lantern. Its warm glow stretched across the rain-soaked lane, reflecting in countless puddles that shimmered like tiny pools of gold. Thomas reached for the leather case. "I'll carry this." "Thank you," she replied. "Keep it dry. We'll need every bandage and every bottle before this night is over." They set off down the hill together. The wind blew colder now. It swept through the valley with a long, mournful whistle, stirring the hedgerows and sending ribbons of mist drifting across the road. Their boots splashed through shallow streams that had formed where the lane had once been dry. For a while neither of them spoke. Only the steady rhythm of rain and footsteps filled the night. At the edge of Ashcombe they passed the village stable. A groom was struggling to calm a restless chestnut mare frightened by the storm. Seeing Thomas, he called out, "The upper road has flooded. You'll have to return through Blackpine Forest." Thomas exchanged a glance with Mrs. Hawthorne. "The forest road it is." The old midwife nodded without hesitation. "I've walked it before." They continued into the darkness. The lanterns bobbed gently through the mist, two small lights in a vast sea of rain. After nearly half an hour, the forest stood before them once again. The pines swayed high above, their branches dripping steadily onto the path below. Mrs. Hawthorne paused for just a moment, listening to the wind. Then she smiled softly. "The storm is testing us," she said. Thomas looked toward the hidden trail. "And we'll keep walking." Together they stepped beneath the towering trees, where the forest seemed darker than before and the sound of rushing water echoed somewhere ahead. The forest held the rain like a great roof of needles. Water gathered high among the branches before falling in heavy drops that landed upon cloaks, hats, and the muddy path below. Thomas walked a few paces ahead, holding the lantern high. Mrs. Hawthorne followed with steady, careful steps. Though the road was rough, she never complained. Around a bend, another light flickered through the mist. Then came the anxious whinny of a horse. Thomas quickened his pace. A small farm cart had slipped into a deep rut where the road curved downhill. One wheel hung helplessly in the air while the other had sunk almost to its hub in thick mud. A young farmer strained against the wheel. His wife held a lantern beneath her cloak, trying to keep the flame alive, while their little boy clung to her hand, wrapped in a wool blanket. "We've been stuck for nearly an hour," the farmer said between breaths. "The horse can't pull it free." Thomas looked at Mrs. Hawthorne. She gave a gentle nod. "Go," she said. "We'll lose less time helping than leaving them here." Thomas removed his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and stepped into the mud beside the wheel. It swallowed his boots almost to the ankles. The horse leaned into its harness. The leather straps stretched tight. The wheel groaned, but it would not move. "The mud has it," the farmer sighed, like a giant hand. Thomas searched the roadside. There, several fallen oak branches lay beneath the hedgerow. Together they wedged the branches beneath the buried wheel. "Once more," Thomas called. The farmer clicked softly to the horse. The animal pulled with all its strength. Thomas and the farmer pushed together. For one long moment, nothing. Then came a loud sucking sound. The wheel climbed onto the branches, rolled forward, and broke free from the mud. The cart lurched onto solid ground. The young farmer laughed with relief. "You've saved us." Mrs. Hawthorne smiled kindly. "Now hurry home before the storm grows worse." The family thanked them again and disappeared slowly into the rain. Thomas picked up the lantern. His hands were muddy, his shoulders ached. But as he looked at Mrs. Hawthorne, she simply adjusted her shawl and said with quiet determination, "Come along, Thomas. Elizabeth is waiting." Without another word, they continued through the cold, misty forest, while somewhere far beyond the trees, a church bell rang once in the darkness. Midnight had come. Midnight had come and gone. The rain still showed no sign of mercy. It poured through the forest in endless silver sheets, dripping from every branch and splashing into puddles that had long since become pools. A cold mist drifted between the pines, wrapping itself around the trunks until the woods seemed to fade into a world of grey. Thomas and Mrs. Hawthorne walked steadily, saying little. Their lanterns cast warm circles of light upon the muddy path, but beyond that gentle glow, the night remained hidden. Then Thomas stopped. "Listen." Mrs. Hawthorne did. At first, she heard only the rain. Then another sound emerged, a deep, rushing roar. "The river," she said quietly. They hurried forward until the trees opened onto the old stone crossing over the Alder Brook. Thomas's heart sank. The brook had become a wild river. Foaming water crashed against the arches of the bridge, carrying branches, broken fences, and clumps of reeds downstream. Spray leapt high into the air, soaking the ancient stones. The bridge itself still stood, but water flowed across its surface, hiding the cobbles beneath a swift, dark current. Just then another lantern appeared through the mist. It belonged to Mr. Briggs, the village miller. He stood beside a sturdy cart loaded with sacks of grain, his powerful draft horse stamping impatiently in the cold. "I've been waiting," Mr. Briggs called. "The water's too strong for my cart." Thomas looked at the bridge, then at the miller. "If we cross together, we'll have a better chance." The miller nodded. He took hold of the horse's bridle. Thomas walked beside the cart. Mrs. Hawthorne followed close behind, one hand resting lightly on the wooden side. Slowly, step by careful step, they entered the rushing water. The current pressed hard against their boots. The horse lowered its head and leaned into the flow. The cart creaked. Rain beat upon their shoulders. For one tense moment, the river seemed determined to push them back. But together they kept moving. One more step, then another. At last, the wheels climbed onto the higher stones at the far end of the bridge. The current loosened its grip. Mr. Briggs let out a long breath and smiled. "We made it." Thomas looked toward the dark road leading to Brambleford. They were closer now, much closer, yet the longest mile of the night still lay ahead. Chapter 15: The Light in the Mist. The road climbed gently from the bridge. Behind them, the roar of the river slowly faded until it became another voice beneath the endless rain. Thomas's legs felt heavy. His boots were soaked through, and every step squelched softly in the mud. Mrs. Hawthorne walked beside him with remarkable determination, though the long journey had begun to show upon her face. Neither of them complained. Far ahead, through the drifting mist, a warm glow appeared. Thomas stopped. "There." Mrs. Hawthorne smiled. Brambleford. The lantern hanging outside the old coaching inn burned like a tiny star in the darkness. As they drew closer, the innkeeper, Mr. Barrett, was fastening the shutters against the wind. He looked up in surprise. "Good heavens, Mrs. Hawthorne. What brings you out in weather like this?" "Elizabeth Carter's baby has decided not to wait," she replied with a gentle smile. Without another word, Mr. Barrett hurried inside. He returned carrying a steaming iron flask wrapped in thick cloth. "Hot broth," he said. "It'll warm you both." Thomas hesitated. "We really shouldn't lose time." "You won't," the innkeeper replied. "Drink while you walk." Mrs. Hawthorne accepted the flask with grateful hands. The rich smell of vegetable broth rose into the cold air. She took a small sip before passing it to Thomas. The warmth spread through him almost instantly, chasing away the chill that had settled deep within his bones. "Thank you," he said. Mr. Barrett tipped his cap. "Godspeed." They continued down the lane. The cottages of Brambleford slowly emerged from the mist, their windows glowing softly through the rain. Then, just as Thomas's heart began to lift, a boy came running toward them, holding a lantern above his head. It was young Oliver, the blacksmith's son. He was breathless. "Mr. Carter!" Thomas hurried forward. "What is it?" Oliver swallowed hard. "Mrs. Ellis sent me." He looked anxiously toward Mrs. Hawthorne. "Elizabeth's pains are much stronger now." For the first time that night, Thomas broke into a run. Mrs. Hawthorne gathered her skirts and followed as quickly as she could. The rain fell harder than ever, racing beside them through the sleeping village. Thomas reached the cottage and pushed open the door. Warm air rushed out to meet the cold night. Inside, the fire still burned brightly, filling the room with the comforting scent of oak. Copper pots of water simmered above the flames, sending gentle clouds of steam toward the old wooden beams. Several village women were already there. Mrs. Ellis stood beside Elizabeth, holding her hand. Old Mrs. Fletcher folded clean linen by the table. Young Mary quietly stirred another log into the fire, keeping the room warm against the bitter storm outside. Elizabeth looked pale, but when she saw Thomas, she managed a faint smile. "You came back." "And I brought Mrs. Hawthorne." The elderly midwife stepped forward at once. She removed her rain-soaked cloak, washed her hands in the steaming water, and opened the leather case Thomas had carried through the storm. The room grew very still. Only the rain continued its steady song upon the roof. Mrs. Hawthorne gently examined Elizabeth before looking toward the others. "The baby is coming tonight." No one spoke. Thomas stood near the fireplace, his soaked clothes slowly drying in the warmth. Every few moments he glanced toward Elizabeth. wishing there was something more he could do. Mrs. Ellis placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "She isn't alone." Thomas nodded quietly. Outside, the wind swept across Brambleford with a mournful whistle. Rainwater overflowed from the gutters and splashed into the lane below. Inside the little stone cottage, the fire crackled, the kettle softly sang, and every heart waited through the longest hour of the night. Then Mrs. Hawthorne looked up. "Thomas." "Yes? We'll need more hot water." Without a word, he lifted the heavy iron kettle from the hearth and hurried towards the well behind the cottage. The storm was waiting for him once again. Thomas pulled his coat over his shoulders and stepped outside. The cold struck him at once. Rain poured from the roof in steady streams, splashing onto the worn stone path that led to the old well behind the cottage. The lantern above the back door swayed gently in the wind, its warm light shimmering across puddles that rippled beneath every raindrop. He hurried across the yard, the empty kettle swinging in his hand. The village well stood beneath a small timber shelter. Water overflowed from the stone trough, spilling onto the ground before disappearing into the mud. Thomas lowered the bucket. It splashed into the icy water below. The rope creaked as he pulled it back up, hand over hand, until the bucket emerged, brimming with cold, clear water. As he poured it into the kettle, a sharp crack echoed through the night. Not thunder, wood. Thomas turned. One of the old elm trees beside the lane had given way under the weight of the soaked earth. It crashed across the narrow road with a heavy thud, blocking the only path leading to the cottage. Within moments, doors opened along the lane. Lanterns appeared one by one. Mr. Barrett from the coaching inn, Mr. Briggs the miller, the blacksmith, still wearing his leather apron. Without needing to be asked, they gathered around the fallen tree. "We'll have it cleared," the blacksmith said. Axes were fetched, ropes were tied. The men worked shoulder to shoulder in the pouring rain, cutting away the thick branches while others dragged them aside. Thomas watched for only a moment before carrying the full kettle back inside. As the door closed behind him, the sounds of chopping and quiet voices blended with the steady rhythm of the storm. Mrs. Hawthorne looked up from Elizabeth. "Thank you." Thomas placed the steaming kettle beside the fire. Outside, the villagers continued working together beneath the rain, making sure that if more help was needed before dawn, nothing would stand in the way. The night seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the rain still fell upon the slate roof. Tap, 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 but it no longer sounded as fierce as before. The wind had grown quieter, leaving only the steady murmur of water running through the village lanes. Inside the cottage, the fire glowed warmly. The kettle steamed. Fresh logs settled gently in the hearth with a soft crackle. Mrs. Hawthorne remained calm, her voice never rising above a gentle whisper. "Very good, Elizabeth. Just one more deep breath." Thomas waited near the doorway. His hands were clasped tightly together. Every now and then, Mrs. Ellis offered him an encouraging smile, but the minutes seemed longer than the entire journey through the storm. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily. Tick, tick, tick. Then silence. For one brief moment, even Thomas forgot to breathe. And suddenly, a tiny cry filled the little stone cottage. Strong, clear, beautiful. Thomas looked toward the hearth, hardly believing what he had heard. Mrs. Hawthorne smiled as she carefully wrapped the newborn in a warm wool blanket. "A healthy little girl," she said softly. Tears gathered in Thomas's eyes. He crossed the room slowly as though afraid the wonderful moment might disappear if he moved too quickly. Elizabeth, exhausted but smiling, reached out to hold their daughter for the very first time. The baby's tiny fingers curled around her mother's thumb. No one spoke. They simply listened. The crackling fire, the gentle rain, and the peaceful breathing of a child who had entered the world on the coldest, wettest night Brambleford had seen in years. Outside, the men laid the last branches of the fallen elm beside the road. The work was finished. Far above the village, the dark clouds began to thin, though no one inside the cottage could see it yet. The first pale light of morning was quietly making its way toward the valley. The grandfather clock chimed softly. 5 o'clock. For the first time in 3 days, the rain began to lose its strength. The heavy downpour faded into a gentle patter, falling quietly from the rooftops and dripping from the branches of the old oaks. Mist still covered the valley, but it no longer felt so heavy. Thomas stepped outside the cottage. The cold morning air filled his lungs. Everywhere he looked, the village shimmered with rain. Water clung to every hedge, every fence, and every blade of grass, catching the faint grey light that slowly spread across the eastern hills. The lane was still muddy. Wheel tracks lay filled with clear rainwater. From the stable came the soft snort of Bracken, who poked his head over the half door as if to welcome the new day. Thomas smiled and stroked the horse's damp nose. "You've earned your rest too, old friend." Across the village, doors began to open. Mr. Barrett carried a basket of fresh bread. Mrs. Ellis arrived with warm milk. The blacksmith brought dry firewood beneath a canvas sheet. Even little Oliver came running with a handful of wildflowers he had gathered before the rain had completely stopped. No one had been asked to come. They simply came. That was the way of Brambleford. Inside the cottage, Mrs. Hawthorne wrapped another blanket around the sleeping baby. Elizabeth rested peacefully, her daughter asleep beside her. The room felt warmer now, safer, full of quiet joy. Mrs. Hawthorne looked out through the rain-speckled window and smiled. The storm has done all it could. Thomas followed her gaze. High above the mist, a narrow band of golden light appeared between the clouds. Morning had finally found the valley. A few moments later, something wonderful happened. The steady dripping from the roof grew slower. Drip, drip. Then at last, it stopped. For the first time in 3 long days, no raindrops fell upon the slate rooftops of Brambleford. The clouds slowly drifted apart, revealing a pale blue morning sky. Thin ribbons of golden sunlight slipped through the mist, touching the wet hills, the stone cottages, and the winding lanes that sparkled as though covered in tiny crystals. The whole village seemed to awaken together. Birds, silent throughout the storm, filled the air with cheerful songs. Smoke rose straight from the chimneys instead of being carried away by the wind. The swollen brook still hurried through the valley, but its angry roar had softened into a peaceful murmur. Thomas stood in the doorway of the cottage with his daughter sleeping peacefully in his arms. Wrapped in a soft wool blanket, she seemed completely unaware of the long, difficult night that had welcomed her into the world. Mrs. Hawthorne stepped outside beside him. She looked across the valley, smiling as the warmth of the rising sun settled gently over Brambleford. "It always feels longest while we're living through it," she said quietly. "But every storm, no matter how fierce, must one day give way to morning." Thomas nodded. He thought of the flooded lanes, the fallen oak, the rushing river, the kind strangers who had stopped to help without asking for anything in return. No one could have reached this morning alone. One by one, the villagers returned to their homes, carrying empty baskets, muddy boots, and tired smiles. Before leaving, each of them paused to peek at the sleeping baby, offering a quiet blessing and a warm wish for the years ahead. As the last of the mist lifted from the valley, sunlight poured through the cottage windows, filling the little stone home with a golden glow. The long night was over, the rain had passed, and in the peaceful village of Brambleford, where kindness had shone brighter than any lantern, a new day began with hope, warmth, and the gentle promise that, after even the darkest storm, light would always find its way home.